So the unit that we are about to start is kind of a mixture of a few different things related to reproduction, for cell reproduction, and human reproduction, and then finally genetics. All three of those, they're all obviously related, but we're going to combine them into this first unit, into this one unit.
No reproduction.
So we're going to start today by talking about cell reproduction. It's the one you did on Google Classroom. Okay, so we know from what we previously talked about that cells are what make up all living things. Our body, for example, is made of trillions of cells working together. Some organisms are made of just a single cell, an amoeba, a paramecium, a bacteria, and all sorts of in between. Some are made of a few cells, some are made of millions and trillions of cells. And cells have the ability to reproduce. So a single cell can
just break off.
In some ways, can basically make a copy of itself in certain situations. Okay? And so why is that important? Well, in our body, we talked about the other day, our red blood cells, for example. They are constantly being destroyed when they're no longer useful. And so obviously your body needs to make new red blood cells. Or if you get a cut on your skin, after several days, it heals because your skin cells, where you've gotten a cut, reproduce and they fill in and produce new skin. Or your skin is always basically being shed a little bit at a time. And so those new cells come about through cells reproducing. When your bones grow larger, or your muscles grow larger, new cells are produced. So cells have the ability to reproduce. And they do that for these reasons. One, to replace old cells that are no longer working, that are no longer useful, you need new cells. To grow new cells, or to go from a tiny little embryo that we all were at one time to a full-size human being with trillions of cells, that requires the cells of that embryo to reproduce and to make more copies in order to grow. And then finally, some organisms, this is actually how they reproduce. It's called asexual reproduction. A bacteria, a single-celled bacteria, can basically just reproduce, and then we have two bacteria. And actually, that's how it reproduces. More advanced animals sometimes, like humans, obviously can't reproduce asexually. And we'll talk about sexual reproduction as we move on to human reproduction. Some organisms, kind of starfish, for example. If you cut a piece of a starfish's arm off, as long as it has a little piece of the central disc, it can grow a whole new starfish. That's an example of asexual reproduction.
Worms can do it.
Yeah. It's reproduction when there's only one parent organism. And it happens through a process of cell reproduction we call mitosis.
So let's say you got a bird, right? Does it reproduce like slowly?
Yeah. If you any real damage to your body would fill in with new cells, typically. Some cells are better at this than others. Like we talked about some of the spinal cord injury. The spinal cord doesn't do a great job healing, but skin cells do, bone cells do. It just sort of depends on the type of tissue. And one thing, and we talked a little bit about this, cancer is our own body cells. So typically when cells make copies of themselves and reproduce, they do it at certain times, and then they stop at certain times. So you get a cut on your skin, the cells there can start to reproduce. Once the cut is filled in, they stop. But there are situations when cells lose control of what we call the cell cycle. And rather than stopping their reproduction when necessary, they continue dividing. And what we call that is those cells have become cancerous, that they form tumors, they form masses somewhere in the body, and that can interfere with the normal functioning of our body. It can happen in the skin or in the lungs or in nervous tissue, all sorts of different places. So really, cancers are our own cells that have lost the control of reproduction. And so when we think about cells, most of the time, cells are just sort of doing their job, right? Digestive cells are producing enzymes, and pancreas cells are making insulin and other things. Nerve cells are transmitting messages. But then, when new cells are required, cell reproduction happens. This is called the cell cycle. And it continues, and then a cell will divide and make a copy of itself. The process in which cells divide and form exact copies is called mitosis. Did you guys learn about mitosis in junior high?
No, I don't think
Not that you remember? Okay. So mitosis, the definition, it's a type of cell reproduction that maintains the chromosome number, keeps the number of chromosomes in the cells the same. In a typical human cell, does anyone know how many chromosomes there are?
23.
23.
Close.
24.
23 pairs of chromosomes, which equals 46 total chromosomes.
Oh, 24.
I don't get
So we have 46, most typical body cells have 46 chromosomes. They come from our parents. Right? 23 came from our mother, 23 from our father. That's how reproduction works. These chromosomes, what are they made out of?
DNA.
They're made of DNA. Our chromosomes, which are found in the nucleus of our cells, they have our genetic code in them. Right? All of the information that makes us pretty much who we are is stored in the DNA that makes up our chromosomes. Chromosomes are made of protein and DNA kind of all wrapped together. You need to write this down. So proteins and DNA together, they form the chromosomes. Chromosomes, they can look like different things. They take different forms depending on what the cell is doing. When a cell is just sort of doing its normal job, you can't even see the chromosomes in the nucleus. They're all unwound. Like if you took a ball of thread and unwound it and just spread it out, that's what they look like. The DNA is not recognizable. But when the cell is going to divide, that DNA lines up into little packages that we call chromosomes. Sometimes they look like this. Sometimes they're a single strand of DNA and protein wound up. But before a cell is going to divide and reproduce, what happens is each of these chromosomes replicates. What does that word mean?
Make more.
Makes an exact copy. And so then they turn into these things that look kind of like X's. These are doubled chromosomes.
I still have no idea what chromosomes are.
A chromosome is protein and DNA together.
Okay, I get it. Sorry, it's just sometimes it's hard to understand,
Yeah,
really.
yeah. So these two sides of this X are basically identical to each other.
Oh,
One was made as a copy of the other. The two copies are held together with a little piece called a centromere that keeps the two halves of the X together. So we talked about we have 46 chromosomes in most cells. 23 of them came from each parent. This is true of sexually reproducing organisms. Half of the chromosomes come from each parent. Okay? And so each chromosome has kind of a partner, one of which came from the mother, one of which came from the father. We call those partner chromosomes homologous chromosomes, is an important word. They have genetic information for the same traits. For example, on one chromosome, there's a list here. This is, scientists have mapped out on the chromosomes where certain genes are. For example, on the 18th chromosome, there is a gene for diabetes. Right? It's on this 18th chromosome. Scientists know exactly where in the chromosomes that gene is. And so for this 18th chromosome, you have two versions of it, one of which came from your mother, one of which came from your father. And you could inherit that gene for diabetes from one parent or the other, or both. It just depends on what traits your parents have and which chromosomes you inherited from them. Andrew?
I think I had a partial genetics disorder, but only partial.
There's a whole host of.
Well, to say disorder, it was like only partial.
Yeah. So there's lots of.
Hard to explain.
Yeah,
It's not like a full disorder.
Yeah, if you look at this list, this is not even all that we know about, but there are tons of different characteristics, risk factors for diseases, and so forth that are stored in our DNA. And so we inherit those. We have the number of chromosomes. We have some words we use when we talk. This is an actual microscope image of doubled chromosomes. This is what they actually look like. You can see they look like X's, right? Each half is identical, and there's pairs of them. So when we think about chromosome number, we just talked about humans. Humans have 46 chromosomes in body cells. We call that the diploid number, okay? And that's when each chromosome has its partner in the cell, one from each parent. And we sometimes abbreviate that with this abbreviation 2N. But in certain cells, there are not the full number of chromosomes. In certain cells, there's only half of that number. We call those cells haploid cells. In humans, can you think of what kind of cells might have half the number of chromosomes as typical body cells?
Inbreds.
No. We'll talk more about this, but the only cells in the human body or in most animals that are haploid are what we call sex cells.
Oh, like sperm?
Sperm cells,
Egg?
egg cells. They have half the number of chromosomes. We'll talk about how that happens, but why, does it make sense why a sperm and egg cell have half the number of chromosomes?
Well, because, you gotta combine them to make a person.
Yeah, when they combine in fertilization, the sperm cell was carrying 23 chromosomes from the father. The egg cell was carrying 23 chromosomes from the mother. They combine during fertilization, and how many do we have?
24 plus 24.
23 and 23.
46.
46 again. And that's the correct diploid number. And that embryo with 46 chromosomes grows into a whole organism that has half the chromosomes from each parent.
The baby.
All right. The number of chromosomes doesn't really mean anything. Humans, yes. The typical number of body cells is 46. But different species have different numbers. It doesn't mean anything. For example, a monkey, a rhesus monkey has 28, a horse has 66 pairs of chromosomes, rabbit has 44, cotton plant has 52. It doesn't mean anything about like the complexity or the size or the intelligence of the organism. It's kind of just a a random number that has evolved over time.
Oh,
So our focus today
it's mitosis.
and tomorrow is to focus on, okay, well, how can one cell reproduce and make a copy of itself, basically, that has the same genetic information, that has the same DNA. And that process of cell division that makes exact copies, we call mitosis. That's the term for it. And we're going to learn about what happens in a cell as it's undergoing this process. Scientists have given names to the different phases as a cell is dividing. This is what it actually looks like. And next week we'll look at slides of dividing cells and try to find these. Here are some diagrams that kind of put it in simplified pictures. And here's the names of the steps. So we're going to talk about the different stages one at a time. So, and I'm going to give you some tips to help you kind of remember what's going on in each phase. So first, when a cell is just living its normal life, doing its thing, like being whatever type of cell it is, that's kind of an in-between phase. It's called interphase. It's like the resting stage. Like I was saying earlier, when a bone cell is just being a bone cell, it's in interphase. It's not actively dividing and reproducing. So it's resting stage. And this is what how we kind of draw it. We just have a cell membrane, and we don't see any chromosomes inside there. This is the nucleus. When I said it's kind of like an unwound ball of string or thread, this is the DNA. These are the chromosomes. We just can't see them. They're all kind of dispersed and spread out. When a cell is going to divide through mitosis, during interphase is when this DNA copies itself. Chromosomes replicate in that time. Because if we're going to make a copy, we need to have a copy of the DNA. These little things, they look kind of like little riggies inside of the cell.
I thought they were pasta.
Yeah, they look like pasta. They're
I
actually...
ate Riggies last night.
Oh yeah, they look like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, riggies look like that. These little riggies are actually a part of the cell. They're called centrioles. You can see they start to form here during interphase. They're going to help with different parts of mitosis. So this is the in-between phase. You can remember, it's in between.
So you're saying what thing looks like a riggies? Oh, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, these things. Oh, more riggies.
Oh yeah,
Oh, geez.
those aren't riggies. They look more like.
These don't have the riggy ridges.
Oh,
What do you call riggy without ridges?
pasta.
ZD.
There we go.
Dang.
Oh,
Yeah.
ZD?
Good.
Yep. All right. Anyway, sorry to distract us.
Worm.
So when the cell is going to start to divide by mitosis, first of all, in interphase, the DNA all copied itself. But now we need to get that copied DNA and put it into two different cells. And so the rest of the phases are how that happens. First, we call this prophase. In prophase, think about the P, it means prepare. The cell's preparing what it needs to do to divide. The nuclear membrane actually dissolves. It starts to disappear, and you can see that in this diagram. You can see they've symbolized it by showing these little dashed lines. Nuclear membranes disappeared. And what happened to the DNA? How does it look now compared to before? Here we have the unwound ball of thread that you can't really see individual chromosomes. But once you go to prophase, now we can start to see the actual chromosomes. This is a diagram. It's nice and neat, and things are little X's that are clear. This is what it really looks like under a microscope. It's not quite so clear, but we can definitely see the chromosomes now. This dark purple is the chromosomes. It's inside of a cell.
It looks like a tapeworm.
And so we can see the sister chromatids. We can see the DNA.
Oh,
We can also see the riggies. The centrioles are moving to opposite ends of the cell, and they're starting to form these little kind of strings or ropes that stretch between the centrioles. This is prophase. Think prepare. The cell's preparing what it needs to do to divide. Next is metaphase.
menopause.
Not quite. Metaphase, not meno. In metaphase, where'd the chromosomes go?
The cell.
Well, they're in the cell.
Out of the cell.
They're in the middle. They line up, single file, in the middle of the cell. We can see the chromosomes here, in the middle. This is called the equator of the cell. So the chromosomes line themselves up in the middle of the cell. You can see the centrioles are on each end. We can see these fibers. They're called spindle fibers. Those ropes. They're stretched all the way across and they're connected to those chromosomes. Can you guess what's going to happen next before you look at the next slide? So these are each identical.
Separate.
They're going to separate. They're going to get pulled to opposite ends of the cell. So metaphase, middle. Correct,
I
Andrew.
already noticed because I looked at.
Oh, those models, yeah. So this is anaphase. What happened to those X's?
They
Split.
split.
They split. They got pulled apart from each other. But this and this, they're identical. The purple one, both sides, they're identical. And so they're getting pulled to opposite ends of the cell. You could remember anaphase, that the A apart. The chromosomes got pulled apart. They're moving to opposite ends of the cell. These spindle fibers are pulling them to opposite ends. It's like tug of war. You guys played that in gym the other day, right? Yeah. Here's what it really looks like. You can see the two chromosomes got split apart. They're going to opposite ends of the cell.
I found this on the web.
Ooh, interesting. And finally,
Can I go to the bathroom?
sure. And finally, the chromosomes got fully pulled to each end of the cell. What's starting to form around them?
A wall?
Sort of.
A barrier? Something?
Where are the chromosomes in a cell? Inside of what?
A nucleus?
Yeah, the nucleus reforms around them. What's happening to the actual cell itself? It's like-
It's reproductive.
It's getting pinched in two. You can see that here. This is called telophase. The nuclear membrane starts to reform, and the cell starts splitting into two. That process is called cytokinesis. How are these cells going to compare in terms of their DNA?
Well, they're gonna be, most the same. I'm pretty
Mostly the same?
Yeah.
Or
sure.
completely the same?
Completely the same.
Yeah. There's an orange chromosome in each one. There's a red chromosome in each one. Purple, dark purple. They're going to have each a copy of the DNA of this cell. And then these two cells, they might be smaller than the original, but they each got a full copy of all of the DNA in this cell. So this cell basically has copied itself. Eventually it'll completely divide and it'll have two cells. We started with one cell. It went through these steps of mitosis, and it became two cells, which have the same DNA and chromosomes. Now, the cell actually splitting, it happens slightly different in plants and animal cells. What we just saw was animal cells. The cell membrane pinches in, and it splits in two. But what's different about plant cells that makes that impossible? Why can't a plant cell just split in two? It has a cell wall around it. And remember, the cell wall is a hard kind of outer shell. It's not flexible. It's non-living. So the way a plant cell splits in two is a little different. Rather than it pinching in, like the animal cell did, what happens is after the chromosomes got pulled to each side, a new cell wall starts to form in the middle. And then eventually it fully forms, and now we have two cells. Okay? So we have two cells here, each of which has an exact copy of that DNA. So this is called the cell plate that forms to split the plant cell into.
Okay, so it doesn't split apart, it just grows like a wall.
Yeah, it grows a wall in between the two cells. But basically the idea is the same. We started with one cell, we ended up with two cells. They have an exact copy of the chromosomes. Let's go to this video in a second. And let's look at this as our last slide for today. And let's kind of give an overview again of the process. You guys have this slide, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Interphase. The first step. We can't see chromosomes in the nucleus. It still has a nucleus. Interphase is in between. Then when the cell is going to start to reproduce through mitosis, we move into prophase. The cell is preparing to divide. The genetic material goes from chromatin and then it condenses so we can actually see it in chromosomes. The nuclear membrane disappears, it dissolves. The rigids form. The spindle fibers form. Eventually, those chromosomes start to line up right in the middle of a cell. That's metaphase. The spindle fibers are attached to the two halves of the chromosome. In anaphase, those spindle fibers pull the X's apart, and a half of each chromosome starts moving to the opposite ends of the cell. And after they've reached opposite ends, we get to telophase. A new nucleus starts to form around each batch of chromosomes, and the cell itself starts to divide into two through cytokinesis, and eventually we end up with two cells. Started with one, we have two cells, but each of those new cells has an identical copy of all of the DNA of all of the chromosomes. And that whole process is called mitosis, cell division, which creates identical cells. All right, any questions about the phases of mitosis or the purpose?
Well, I think it's the purpose is, I think we already talked about it, like, it creates new cells to replace old ones.
Exactly. Or new cells to repair damage, or new cells for an organism to grow. Or if you think about a fertilized egg, it's one cell. It has to grow into trillions of cells. It does that by mitosis happening over and over and over again.